part of reading this book is understanding God's in control. It may not look like it right now. Look at our world today. It may not look like it, but God is still in control. Somebody said to me, well, you see everything that's happening? There's floods everywhere. There's all these fires burning across the globe. And I said, yeah, and do you not read your Bible? Where it says, looking towards the last days of wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes. It's all written right there in the book. But you'd have to read the book and believe it to say, I guess this is part of what's under God's control. God will let things happen. It doesn't mean everything's going to be great that God lets happen, but it's for a purpose usually. Turn in your Bible to Matthew 2. And I want us to read this very, very carefully. You know, when you're so familiar with something, sometimes you can gloss read it and not read exactly what's there, right? Okay. Matthew 2. If you have a Bible like mine, it says the visit of the Magi is the header. And I don't always like the headers because sometimes they don't even sum up. It's like, who did this? But this one's okay, I guess. Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and are come to worship him. When Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he demanded of them where Christ should be born. They said unto him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for it is written by the prophet. And here comes the quote, kind of, or at least part of it. And thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, art not least among the princes of Judah, for out of thee shall come a governor that shall rule my people Israel. Then Herod, when he privily called the wise men, inquired them diligently what time the star appeared. Now there's a lot in here that if you just read it just as I did, you could miss it. So I want to really be deliberate here. The first thing I want to parse in this is I want you to pay attention to something. Bethlehem of Judea, first verse, all right? Now, why do I point this out? When people talk about the accuracy of this book, and we're not talking about the King James translators or the NLT or the ASV or the RSV, we're talking about just looking at the word, we can know that there are certain ways to conclude the writing of this done at a set period, and I'll tell you why. We know that Judea, first known to us scripturally as Judah around 934 BC, a territory assigned to the tribe of Judah that also the other tribes that were clustered with it, all right? During the Persian Empire, Judah was called Yehud. I'm saying it just as you'd see it, Yehud, but it would have been a little bit less of the Yeh, all right, just like very more softer, but Yehud. Judea is first introduced in the Bible in the book of Ezra as a province of the Persian Empire and after the Babylonian captivity. So kind of put a check there. And specifically under Roman rule, the son of Herod, we know, Archelaus, being banished, Judea became annexed to the Roman province of Syria and was ruled from Antioch. And there's a reason why I'm putting this out there. With so many people always fighting about how could these writers have written this, you've got to look, there's some kind of internal evidences, which is not my message today, but just to show you how if you were doing this on your own, you would look for internal evidences. There's one clearly right here. If this Gospel of Matthew was written, say, between the period of, we'll just put it between 50 and 60 AD. Just say, okay? The reference of Judea, and specifically where he mentions born in Bethlehem of Judea, there's a specific reason for mentioning Bethlehem of Judea and also specifically mentioning Judea. And that is, if this book was written after 132 AD, the writer could not have written this without qualifying and saying that Judea and Galilee had merged by 132 and had become known as the enlarged province of Syria, Palestina. That's how it was known after 132. So if you're looking for small internal evidences, there's one. The second one we're going to look at, and it'll keep coming up, is Herod. Now, again, when people argue about the veracity and the contents of this book, you almost have to stop people from doing this very ignorant thing. Well, these people must have made it up and they must have filled in the blanks. I've said this to you before. The reason why Jesus explains to them the Holy Spirit is going to come alongside is he will remind you of everything that I said and everything that's happened. So not that they had great memory and perfect recall, the Holy Spirit helped them. But on top of that, imagine if you were creating a story and you were trying to include current names and events, you would have to be very accurate. So the fact that Herod is included, and Herod is not, he's a secular figure. We know him from the secular world. So that opens up a whole conversation about the question of, if we were looking at Jesus' birth, what year this took place. Now, you almost have to read two stories, Matthew and Luke, and try to understand that, for example, Luke has we'll call it the birth narratives for a purpose. Luke's birth narratives are designed for us to be able to know when Jesus was born by virtue of including the story of Zacharias and Elizabeth, the parents of John the Baptist, explaining that he was serving in the temple. I've gone through this before. So we have that clarity out of Luke. Luke's was not designed, the way he wrote this, was not designed for us to then leap into the idea that the newly born child was being visited by the Magi. And these are all these internal evidences that all begin to merge as you put this story together. So when I talk about validity, veracity, we have to look for certain internal things. And as I just pointed out, the reason to include Bethlehem of Judea is there is another Bethlehem, I believe in Zebulun. So the writer took the time to distinguish the place of birth specifically, not just based on chronicling where the child was born, but it also aligns up with the prophecies that there's in part a prophecy written here about in verse 6, and thou Bethlehem in the land of Judah, and so on. So it's important to look at those internal evidences and understand that if we can lean on some of those, we can also do a little bit better in understanding, for example, the argument, I'll just go there right now, of Herod. So every document that you're going to read in the secular says Herod died in 4 BC. The question then begs this, and you have to kind of follow the math. If Herod issues an edict, which I didn't read this part, but basically he tells the wise men to come back and report when they find the Christ child, and when they don't, he issues the edict to wipe out every male child 2 years and younger. But what we don't understand is that was not like some nationwide edict. That was to an area. And so it's not unclear for us. And again, it's this very silly mindset that would make it like Herod issued a decree for all the children of the entire land to be killed. And it was a specific area, probably comprising no more than about 20 children. If you'll follow my logic and you'll see why I'm explaining these little tidbits. They become important in the bigger picture. All right. As I said, this will come up again and again, the controversy of the date of Herod's death. And the reason why I say that is because most secular records put his death at 4 BC. There is good reason to actually question that date for several reasons. One, because that would tell us, at least in an area of when Christ was born, which may not line up with other issues, but something else. His sons, we have good reason to believe that his sons, he had one of his sons executed. Nice dad, huh? But we have reason to believe that they were either co-heir and that his health was in decline, not necessarily that he died in 4 BC. And I'm not going to take a dogmatic position until we have other evidences to look at. I'm just putting it out there. But there is good reason to believe that his sons began to rule in his stead while his health was failing. And I say that because if you do a little probing, you find that there were coins being minted of his sons, but at the same time, there was no official grieving or mourning of his death, which is really odd because in antiquity, they did things a certain way. So this one we'll have to come back and look at. But I want you to take a look at something else that's in the text. Pay close attention to what these wise men say. Or let's look at the conversation starting at verse 2. So, where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star. His star. You can even circle that because it's mind-boggling. And if you were looking in the Greek, there is a possessive pronoun there. His star in the east, and are come to worship him. So his star, not just a star, his star. And why should that kind of ring out for us? As I said, the writers, we tend to kind of dumb them down, but they wrote with intent. It may not be the most eloquent penmanship or something, but they wrote with specificity. So very interesting to me. They also say, they didn't say they came seeking a king of the Jews, but they said they came seeking the King of the Jews. Now, most people read this passage, they don't read it, the details. Take a look at something else. In verse 1, you're going to see wise men from the east. And in verse 2, it says, that, for we have seen his star in the east. Now, let me ask you a question. We're all gathered here at Faith Center. And let's just say it was a nighttime service, there were no city lights, and we looked up in the sky, or better yet, we're at the Griffith Observatory. How's that? Check that out. We moved up. We look up, we see something in the sky. We would probably say the direction we saw it, but if we were reporting, we would say we were in Glendale, we looked up and we saw that star in that direction. So the writing here is kind of tricky because, listen, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, most probably defining where they came from, where they were coming from in their travels. However, when they say, for we have seen his star in the east, in the Greek there's a little weird thing that goes on. So in the east, apo Anatolon, Anatolon east, right? And then you have, so one is in the plural and one is in the singular. It makes you kind of say, okay, in the first place, men came from the east, says maybe these men came from an area, plural, not all the same, but his star in the east. So we can know something. They followed the star, and other internal evidences tell us that there were literally no other witnesses to this star. Don't ask me, I didn't write the book, all right? Why do I say that? Because when they report to Herod, Herod had heard these things, was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And by the way, that's also a bad translation, because most of the people living in Jerusalem were not in accord with Herod's policies, and there was a lot of polarized hatred towards Herod. So when it says, and all Jerusalem with him, probably against or towards him, not with him in the sense that they aligned with him. That you need to also know the history of the people to know they would have never been troubled with him. They were troubled by him and of him. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes, which, by the way, these he will later execute. Nice. So come tell me what you know, and when you don't give us enough information, off with your head. That could actually be a new government policy. That might work good. Tell us what you know. All right. So when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of all the people together, he demanded of them where Christ should be born. Now that tells you something. Herod is demanding it, but anybody of his surroundings, of the priests. They knew because they knew the prophecies. So that tells you something about Herod. Herod could not have been a man of the scriptures. He could not have been a man of the book. He would have known this. So just kind of put that down. As I said, there's internal evidences here that in the big picture, if you add them all up, it paints a picture of this individual, of the circumstance and the setting in which this unfolds. They said unto him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for it's written by the prophet, and it's a half quote, as I said. Then Herod, when he had privily called the wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. That tells you that he either A, did not see the star at its outset, or didn't see it at all. What time did the star appear? That's weird, because if it was a bright star, seems to me that everyone would have seen it. Just saying. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search diligently for the young child, and when you have found him, bring me word again, that I may come and worship him also. Now this is kind of an interesting twist. When they had heard the king, they departed, and lo, the star, which they saw in the east, went before them till it came and stood over where the young child was. Now, very important, these words do not say baby. Do not say baby in swaddling clothes. That's Luke's passage, young child. And the Greek is very distinct. So this will tie into the rest of what happens here. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. And when they were come into the house, that's another indicator that the baby is no longer mother and child in manger. See how things get conflated, right? When they were come in the house, they saw the young child and Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And they had opened their treasures. They presented unto him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And being warned of God in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed into their own country another way. Now this is what's fascinating to me. Obviously, God did not speak or show his hand to Herod. But to these wise men, follow the thinking here. In a dream, they were warned not to return. Okay, we know that Herod will then take up the decree to basically eliminate any child 2 years and under, but understand, as I said, it has to be denoted it is the territory where Christ would be born, not the full entire land. Otherwise, you would have a mass massacre of children. So just kind of put that in the pot there. That's pretty important. All right, so when we, and I've talked about this before, people typically will send cards at Christmas time when you see them in the drugstore or something. You know, it's 3 men, 3 camels, usually a Christmas tree in the background or a sun, okay? Okay, it's a really very authentic understanding. As I said, we don't know the number of these men. That's number one. We know that based on the gifts that they were bearing, I've said this before, there had to be more than 3. Please think of this way. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh were all very, very costly. They would have been in a large caravan. They would have had people accompanying them. And when you begin to learn who these men actually were, we're talking about, when we say men from the east, we're talking about men, first of all, referred to as Magi. We get the word Magi into our language, magic. Now, that comes to us from the Greek and the Latin, but if you go into the Persian, the meaning of that word changes slightly to a priestly class of very high and well-educated people, not magicians. It's interesting how things can get a little twisted. So I happen to believe that these men were beyond, when we say wise, I think they had understanding of things that we just don't have. And I believe they had a gift of God. Obviously, God directed them with a star specific to them and also spoke to them in a dream, didn't speak to Herod. So I want you to see there's a lot of details to kind of juxtapose in here. I also want to say that when it says they worshipped, they fell down and worshipped him, I would say that probably as they were headed towards where the child was, the idea was they're going to come and pay homage. But as they entered into the house, they actually worshipped, and that's kind of an important detail. Let's go back to one more thing, which is in this passage out of Matthew. Kind of an interesting thing. Why I'll say it like this, why did God have either the wise men go to Herod or Herod dispatch these wise men, considering he had a court, he's a king, he's got people that could do his bidding. So something tells me we have to elevate these men to a little bit more than just how we've painted them, wise men. I think that they were godly men. You've got to also do a little bit of the history. And when we look at the history is very, very helpful. We know that the Magi probably date back definitively to a pre-Babylonian period. And when the Medo-Persian Empire, when we had that whole transition occur, it's very safe to say that as people were deported to Babylon, we're speaking about the children of Israel now, it seems very clear, and I spoke about this before, there were people that stayed there and they did not return. So to me, it's not impossible that these men had access to some form of the Old Testament, because there was no New Testament yet, and they were familiar with prophecies of old, biblical prophecies of old. Now, I'm not saying that these men stand as religious leaders per se, but they had understanding, obviously. So when it says that they followed the star and then the star basically led them, I want to say that this has to be like God's. We don't see stuff like this. It's like people grappling with, well, for example, when God made the sun stand still, and we say, well, God, that couldn't happen. Well, it could if God's doing it. We can't make it happen. We can talk about how crazy that is, but if God controls everything, wind and water, it's like Jesus speaking to the sea and calming the sea. Who's able to do that? I don't know about you, but if you've ever been out on a rough sea saying, shh, doesn't really work, right? So I would just say, pretty important, the details here as you start to kind of line them up. There's something else I want to say, which is the timing of the appearing of the star. In Jewish tradition, the star would have appeared years before the actual birth of Messiah. Now, we don't know how long these men were looking at that star in their homeland before they journeyed off, because it seems to me, based on what's in Matthew and what's in Luke, that they didn't just look up and see a star and go, oh yeah, that's the one we're going. It seems like they were observing this for quite some time. I don't want to get trapped into the narrow mindset of trying to figure out exactly when they departed. I'm just saying to you, it seems to me that they would have waited a while, and that while could have been 6 months, it could have been a year before they departed. When we read that Herod called these wise men before him to inquire as to the exact time the star appeared, that sets off something in my brain. The deep desire for Herod to know something about this child. Is that the first question you're going to ask? Because to me, if I was asking the questions, I'd say, well, how do you know about this child? What do you know that I don't know? That would be kind of the line of questions that I would ask. I was going to say interrogating, but that'd be the line of questions I would ask, okay? So it's kind of strange to me that he wants to know the exact time the star appeared. Would that matter? Well, maybe if they said, yeah, it appeared 3 years ago, they don't give an answer, but if they said 3 years ago, maybe that would be the clue. Maybe the child is 3 years old, I don't know. But that's the strangest question to ask. So as we kind of pick through this, every part of the account, if you think about it, does align with other things historically. The reign of Herod aligns there, the naming of the town, specifically the way the town is named. It's not named Syria Palestina, it is named Judea, which tells you it's right in concert with the right time of writing. If somebody said, I want to argue these details. And the other thing I want to talk about is the star stopping above where the child was. Now, for anybody who hasn't studied this book, they'll roll their eyes and go, yeah, see, that's why I don't believe the Bible, right? You'd have to know the history of God's ways, and God's ways and man's ways are just so far apart. How did he lead the children of Israel at nighttime in the wilderness? Pillar of fire. We would say, well, how could a pillar of fire be moving, physically moving. That was God, and we know that fire is an emblem for God in the scriptures. The bush that burned that wasn't consumed, right? So I want you to think about this. He moves in a cloud by day. There are different ways that God reveals himself. So to me, I think it's very obvious that God was with these men and led these men. And somebody might say, but stars can't move like that. Well, if you're the person who hung them in the sky, they can, right? Just remember that. I get really very annoyed with people who tend to dismiss the book because they can't make certain things, humanly speak, work. And here's what I'd say to those people: grow up. There are a lot of things in the universe that we can't understand. Can you? Does anybody truly? I read a lot of books on string theory, but at the end of the day, if you can really wrap your mind around it, it would kind of enlighten you that the things that you see aren't necessarily how they really are in the material world versus any other world and dimensions and so forth. So I get really tired of very narrow-minded people who think, oh, but that couldn't possibly happen. It's like I was talking to somebody one time and they said, well, I just don't believe the story of Jonah being swallowed by a great fish, so that's why I don't believe the book. Really? I call that being very lame, because if you want God to be like you down on your base flesh level, that just tells me you have no clue of who God is and what his powers are. Understanding, part of reading this book is understanding God's in control. It may not look like it right now. Look at our world today. It may not look like it, but God is still in control. Somebody said to me, well, you see everything that's happening? There's floods everywhere. There's all these fires burning across the globe. And I said, yeah, and do you not read your Bible? Where it says, looking towards the last days of wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, it's all written there, right there in the book. But you'd have to read the book and believe it to say, I guess this is part of what's under God's control. God will let things happen. It doesn't mean everything's going to be great that God lets happen, but it's for a purpose usually. What I'm trying to say to you is we have to be savvy enough to read the book and not try to make projections into it somehow that, well, that couldn't happen. So yes, God did move a star for these men, which adds to the whole mind-boggling thing. These were not men that came out and identified, yes, we are the children, we are the lost tribes. They are wise men. Ostensibly, we're all going to say we think they must have come from the region of Babylonia, traveling to this land. And again, why? Why? But there had to be, in my opinion, there had to be a witness, not just of God with the star in the sky, but of what does it take to have a witness in Jewish reckoning? 2 or 3 witnesses. So I'm not saying there were 3 wise men, there was probably more, but there is your identification for the purpose of this message. So, we may say, some people have tried to say, well, the star was in the zenith. That's not without issue either. So I'm going to park that for just a minute. We should also consider that if they were familiar, if these wise men were familiar with the writing of Micah, they would have gone directly to Bethlehem. Did you hear what I just said? Now, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen a star in the east, and we have come to worship him. They would have gone straight there. So here's the mystery. Did they know or did they not know where Jesus was born? We'll come back and we'll see if we can answer that, maybe. We can postulate, just for in the sake of this exchange, that they probably didn't have that information, or as I said, I think they would have gone straight there. And then there's something else. The star appeared to them. It says that they came from the east. His star in the east appeared to them. And then again, after this exchange with Herod, it says that basically when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. I'm not sure. I'm just going to put this out there. This is just complete speculation. I'm not sure if the star moved, appeared, disappeared, and reappeared. I'm not sure based on the way this is written. And I'm not saying there's any specific mystery to this. I'm just saying read carefully. Because sometimes we read so fast, it's like we miss small words. And even if you were trying to talk to somebody who said, I don't believe any of this, and force them to read the words that are identifiers, this kind of brings a whole new way of looking at the scriptures, but you got to read it carefully. So we'll abandon the scripture part, whether they were familiar or not. I'm going to lean towards they weren't. Okay, so we have the star, his star appearing in the east, Herod asking what time the star appeared. And when they'd seen the star, they were overjoyed. I think they had to know at some point when the star begins to move that this is not normal. These were men who were well versed in looking up at the sky, so they had to know they were being guided by someone else. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about that, because there's a lot there. But and again, if you're interested in taking a deeper dive, knock yourself out, because there's a lot there. Just like I said, read carefully. In the account of Jesus' birth, we have, as I said, two narratives. The one that appears in Matthew 1:18 through 25, and what appears in Luke's Gospel. And as I said earlier, the reason for putting this together like this is to show people, to try and get people to read a little bit more carefully. Because we know, if we're looking at the writing of Matthew, Matthew starts his writing by the genealogy to prove the connection that Christ is not some newcomer. He didn't just arrive on the scene, but there are generations. Basically, he goes back and opens it by saying, Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham, and starts chronicling, showing how he is connected from the earliest lineage right down to his birth. And then we have what we'll call the birth narrative, the birth of Jesus, which occurs in 1:18, and telling us a little bit about Mary not being yet married to Joseph, being pregnant but not having done the deed to get pregnant, and so on. And then we have the Magi. Okay, if you look at Luke's Gospel, and this is what I'm going to say this very simple, because I want people out there who are the chronic mumblers about this to just pay attention. In Luke's Gospel, the opening of Luke's Gospel has, yes, a record, if you will, that is beginning with John the Baptist. And the reason why is, if somebody will read this carefully, I've gone through this and I've preached many messages on this subject before, but if you'll go through it really carefully, it will show you that Zacharias was serving in his course in the temple, and we've traced back the courses of the priests that go all the way back to the Old Testament, where they had the 24 courses and then they would just repeat. So the reason for including this is to show us we have Zacharias and Elizabeth, husband and wife. They will have a child. The child is John the Baptist. And then we have the record of the angel appearing to Mary and telling her, you will be with child. And then, of course, when the child is born, that's chapter 2, different information. Came to pass in those days, chapter 2, that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. And all went to be taxed, every one to his own town. And Joseph went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth in Judea unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David. So a lot of information right in there, but what I want to tell you is this. We have the start of explaining the birth of Jesus with a decree from Caesar Augustus, taxation. So this is all with reason. It's all with purpose. And most people will just read this and think, oh, it's a birth narrative, or it's an infancy narrative, and the end of story. No, it's not. It's to show you two things. This particular chapter, if studied properly, will give you the date, closest to the accurate date of Christ's birth, which is not December 25th. Because if you follow the courses of Zacharias' service in the temple, he says he's serving in the course of Abijah. We can trace that back and know then when he basically finds out about Elizabeth being pregnant, and then we have 6 months later the birth of Jesus. So it's put in here by design, and then the information in the second chapter, came to pass in those days there went a decree from Caesar Augustus and all the world that all the world should be taxed. That's a different piece of information. And what happens is we tend to read this and we tend to conflate everything. And that's the messiest story in the world. So they're actually two different periods are being talked about. And that's what we have to remember, because the birth of Jesus, for example, forgive me, the birth of Jesus in Luke's gospel, you have shepherds coming out, abiding in the field. This is actually the record, if you want to put it this way, of closer to the birth of a child than the record given, which in Matthew's account is not the birth of that child like Luke does it. So they're done for two different reasons, explaining two different things. And again, if you don't think that God had intent in giving this information to the two different writers to write, one is explaining to us something about the period and not necessarily at the birth of the child. One is explaining to us at the birth of the child and coming from the place of telling us when Mary conceived and when she gave birth, basically through those passages. So it would help if people stopped conflating those two passages. That would alleviate a lot of the craziness that people spout out afterwards. So the big question is, why is the star recorded in Matthew but not Luke, seeing that would be quite a big event, right? That's another question we have to ask. And again, some people get very frustrated. You ask all these questions. Do you think that's right? Yeah, I do, because that's how we learn. That's how we see differences. That's how we highlight things. So it was not Luke's intent to show the divine manifestation in that way. Luke is going to show it in a different way by explaining how Mary got pregnant. So we have two different approaches, and they need to be looked at that way. We can only speculate, by the way, as people ask a lot about this, wasn't Joseph present? Because we're reading two different accounts. It's pretty safe to say, and most people agree with this, that Joseph probably did not live to see the public ministry of Jesus. Either that, or we could also assume some of the antiquity records say that he was actually put to death. Now, which one, I can't say, but it's pretty sure there's no mention of him during Christ's public ministry. We do read of Mary in brief appearances, but not Joseph. Okay, so let me move on. If we're still looking at Luke's gospel, in Luke's gospel, as I said, we learn of Zacharias and Elizabeth, parents of John the Baptist, the birth of John the Baptist, the census which caused Joseph to travel to Bethlehem, the shepherds, the presentation of Jesus as a 12-year-old boy in the temple. So remember, Luke came along later, and his design, as probably the companion of Paul and not part of this original group of disciples, was to put all things in order. But there's only so much information he's going to get from the eyewitnesses to the event, so I think he did fill in some of the blanks, and maybe some of them are not first-hand testimony, we can't say. But do not think that the records are in disagreement. They are two different records focusing on two different angles, and we have to be smart enough to take that way. Of course, the other thing that we're given in Luke is the forerunner to Christ, John the Baptist, and where did he come from, right? We're told, for example, in the Old Testament, he is the forerunner going before Christ. Well, we wouldn't have known anything about him if he just appeared on the scene baptizing people. So again, very methodic to include who the parents were, the birth narrative, to show all of that for John the Baptist. And again, these stories begin to mesh together properly. So if you're reading it in sequence, it makes sense. Just a little sidebar. It's always better if you read it in sequence, by the way. All right. So Matthew, we know, tells us of the star, the Magi, Herod's design to kill the children born ostensibly in the area where this child is born, the massacre of innocent children, and the flight to Egypt. In Matthew's writing, Joseph and Mary live in a house in Bethlehem. In Luke, Jesus is born in a stable or something akin to that, but not a house. So we can know something. They are separated by the child's age. So 2 separate stories written, maybe say one is of a newborn child and maybe one is of a child that's maybe close to 2 years old, something in that realm. And there's then the reason why Herod would say 2 years to kill children 2 years and younger. That being said, it's safe to say that there was the knowledge that this child couldn't have been born more than 2 years earlier. So I want you to think about this. We're going to start to try and put pieces together, which I won't have success doing all today. But if he sought to kill children 2 years and younger, and Herod died supposedly in 4 BC, tell me where that puts the birth of Christ. Don't answer. Better to not answer. All right. There's one other weird place that I looked for information on this subject, and it comes from the writing, the Proto-Evangelium of James. Not the book of James, the Proto-Evangelium of James. And I wrote it out so I can read it to you. There came wise men saying, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, have come to worship him." Herod sent for these men and questioned them, "How it is written concerning the Messiah, where is he born?" They replied, "Bethlehem of Judea, for it is so written." They let him go. And there is no more detail, but again, it begs the question if this writing is just a perpetuation, like a later fraud that was written later, or if there was any more additional information out of that has any validity. And I can't speak, I can only speak on what's in the book, but I thought I'd mention that to you. If we turn to another writing from the bishop of Antioch in Syria, Ignatius, who wrote an epistle to the Ephesians, and in it, in chapter 19, we find the following. It's interesting. "A star shone in heaven beyond all stars. Its light was beyond description, and its newness caused astonishment. All the other stars with the sun and the moon gathered in chorus around the star, but it far exceeded them all in its life." Now, he wrote this while he was under military custody before his martyrdom. Could the Holy Spirit have revealed something to him? Possibly. Or is this, again, some tale that circulated in his day? We can't say. There are other people writing around the time of Ignatius stating the same thing. But again, I cannot verify the source, so I'm not including them. All right, when Herod realizes that these men are not coming back, he gets a little mad. His anger starts to show, and it leads to terrible events. As you've heard me now mention, he sends out his army to murder every child under the age of 2. But as I said, what this meant, in the area where Jesus born, there could not have been a population of more than 1,000 people. So we could make the estimate based on the number we have. Possibly if there was a slaughter, it would have only been, as I said earlier, 20 children. I don't mean like only, but we tend to make it sound like there was this massive millions. Of course, if you read some of the later writing, you've got this number blown out of proportion with millions of children were massacred. It's probably about 20, okay? But what is clear is that Herod did not know how old Christ was, because he says 2 or younger. That puts like, hey, we'll put the bar here, and anything under that, we're sure to get him. So that tells you he didn't have that information. I love that. I don't know why, it just makes me happy. But we can also know that Herod's men would not have had very much assistance from the local people, because Herod, if you read carefully, was despised by most of the population. And so I just kind of find that interesting. It's kind of like California and its leadership, right? It's like that's our Herod right there, right? Okay, just got to say it, okay? I don't want to be a hater, but just saying. All right. So when it comes to estimating the time of Jesus' birth, we get some wild ideas, a large spread. Because if Herod died in 4 BC, and let's just say that he did die in 4 BC, all of this would have had to have happened before that time, before 4 BC, right? Would make sense. So now you're not looking at, when people talk about, okay, we've got these dates that have basically been stuck on the calendar. Some people say 1 BC, 2 BC, 3 BC. But can you see how becoming dogmatic on this subject can lead you down a really bad path? Because there is, right now, we may find clarity, but right now, there's not one thing that agrees with something else. The only thing we can agree on is that whether Herod died in 4 BC or he retired and let his sons reign in his stead, that 4 BC date, whether he died or not in that year, becomes important if you're looking at what is said here, which is in the days of Herod the king. What does that tell you? He was still alive. So all of this has to occur before 4 BC. Just put a period there, because all of these, we'll call them pieces, come out eventually. Okay? Before the 4th century, if there are any records of the celebration of Christ, they are scant at best. This is the other thing that people will get very mad at me, because every time I talk about Jesus not being born December 25th, I'll get hate mail from people who just are on this crazy mission to tell me that I'm anathema because I said that, when in fact we can prove, and I can prove it over and over and over, if you're willing to listen, if you're willing to look. Trust me, I was one of you before. Oh, Christmas is in the Bible, I swear it, I'm going to find it, right? Yeah, okay, good luck. So the only date we find being repeated in antiquity is January 6th, which is the record of Epiphany. But it's the Pope Liberius, sometime around 353 AD, moved the celebration from January 6th in 353 AD to December 25th in 354 AD. Now there's a lot of confusing and conflated history that is recorded in the Catholic annals, and you have to be very careful. If you're going to go down that pathway, you need to know that a lot of those records have already been doctored. So anything that has any real source validity is locked up in the Vatican, which we'll never see. And a lot of the dogma and doctrine that's produced by the Catholic Church has already been massaged enough that when the masses read it, it's digestible. December 25th is a very plausible date. But for the purposes of mentioning this, once we start investigating, we can see that there was a lot of attempts to move the date of Christmas, the birth date of Christ around. Don't think this happened in one year or in one conference or in one time. There were a lot of attempts, failed to move the date until finally it became, this is the date that standardized the birth of Christ, which is not, you know, I wish people would read history. It's right there. It tells you how they moved the dates around and how they held a council. And then at one council, they decided, well, we need to have a unanimous date and set a unanimous date. And just remember that birth celebrations were only done for people who were of royalty. A common person didn't have, like, we celebrate our children's birth, right? And it's a birthday, we cake, candles. They didn't do any. Unless you were royalty, you had a birthday celebration. So I also want you to think about how, from the time of the record we have until about those 300s, in that window, they were not trying to hardcore fix that date. And in fact, there were a lot of people that were, we'll call them the anti, not quite Reformation, but the move to get it away from December 25th. You've got to go back and read Catholic history and see that there's a lot of monkey business there. So just saying, that's something else. But we do know that the pagan Saturnalia played a large part in the influence of dates to celebrate. You have to look no further than, I've told you this before, the record of the mother of Constantine, Emperor Constantine, Helena, who was obviously had a heavy influence on her son. And we know the story that she purportedly went and found, for example, the titulus of Christ and brings it back, and they begin venerating that. They begin worshiping wood that was found. By the way, this is the crazy thing. We now know that where she found the wood is called the Cave of Adonis. I think we should come back to that one when everybody's awake. Now claimed as a Christian site. Does that speak anything to you? No, I don't know. Maybe you'd have to look up who Adonis is. So there's a lot of problems here. And the only way to get clarity is to go back and reread between Matthew and Luke to establish some proper time frames. You've got, so we do have to, or we should try to identify the star if we can. Oh, that's a big task. We should probably take a second look at the courses of the priest, but there's plenty of messages on that. We should look at Christmas traditions. If you're wanting to pick all this apart, it's very easy. We know that, for example, the book of Jeremiah talks about them chopping down trees and decking them with ornate ornaments. That's a Christmas tree right there. But if you really want the origins, I mean, yes, that's out of Jeremiah, but the origins of how it got grafted in, those origins start in Germany probably about the 1600s, where they started basically decorating trees, not the way we do it. And it stuck, and it became a popular thing. And if you know your American history, there was a period where there were no Christmas celebrations because it was deemed a pagan holiday. I mean, just a little bit of history reading and you go, whoa, and where are we now? Because everybody is on the bandwagon. Yeah, God forbid we should read history, right? We know the Saturnalia lasted from the 17th to the 24th of December, and then the Sol Novus, or the Sol Invictus, December 25th, the Feast of the Unconquered Sun, and the victory over, for that feast, it's the victory over light over darkness, celebrated. But we have enough evidence to see that January 6th was in observance by 311 AD, and this will be at the core of East and West churches bifurcating. So you know how a lot of our Greek brothers and sisters, they celebrate Christmas and everything else later. They are still practicing from the original Orthodox practices, and this was the schism of the East and the West. So again, if this was an exact date, and it was really a date, this is not dissing on Catholics or Orthodox. It's just saying if it was an exact date, how can we have two churches celebrating two different dates? And you say, well, we believe differently. Well, why? Well, what saith the scriptures, right? You got to be looking in the book, I guess. And the Orthodox do tend to, although they have a lot of different practices I do not agree with. We don't venerate icons. We don't worship icons and pray to icons. But a lot of their orthodoxy, that word comes into play, is to try and stay closer to what they believe is the revealed truth. We'll leave that one alone because it's a big one to tackle. So January 6th, by the way, is also associated with other pagan celebrations such as the celebration of water. So what did I just say to you today? I said a lot of stuff. But if you start gathering the pieces, this is what I'm trying to get you to do, is do a little digging on your own. You start to gather the pieces, and there are a couple of things that just stand out real loud and clear. One of them is the inclusion of Herod being alive tells you that Christ had to be born in Herod's lifetime, before he died or before he retired. That has to put his birth before 4 BC. Unless the writer is lying, okay? That's one. Two, we definitely know if we follow Luke's gospel, we can definitively prove that the birth of Christ is not December 25th. We can also know that the Magi's visit, people have said, well, the visit, you'll see where the tradition goes, was on January 6th. Don't think so. There's no way to prove that. Just happens to align with another date, so woo, right? We would jump on the bandwagon. There's no proof of that either. I'm looking for proof. I'm taking the position to try and tell somebody who absolutely, unequivocally does not believe. I want proof. I don't want speculation. So we can prove, if you go through the courses of the priest, you can prove when John the Baptist was born. And through that, 6 months later, Jesus is born, and it does not put you at December 25th. We can prove, if we want to be just trying to find the facts, the writer of this book had to be writing within the time frame that we attribute to the writers of the New Testament. He's using the proper terminology for Judea, as the name was not yet changed. I mean, there's a lot of these. And as you build this case, you're going to find there's more historical hard points, including even what's mentioned in Luke about the census from Augustus Caesar. And you might say, well, can we follow that one? Well, yeah, that was kind of my plan. Okay, just not today. I think there's only so much the brain can handle at one time. But what we can do is we can say, do you think it's possible, based on what we looked at, Gospel in the Stars, do you think it's at all possible that these men, unlike their Jewish counterparts who had little interest in the sky, do you think it's possible that they understood not only the zodiac, as we've looked at, but also understood that God's hand had to be in the sky, placing those there, and that the star that they saw, could that star be an independent star outside of what we looked at? Or could this really have been a star that they identified in the sky, started following it, and then the star began to move? That's possible too. So we have a lot of work to do in digging. I don't know if we're going to be able to answer all the questions, but I think we'll be able to answer some of the questions. This is my challenge to some of my listeners out there. Start trying to parse between the stuff that is completely irrelevant, that doesn't make any difference, and the pieces of information in here that actually, when you start searching and digging, they start building a foundation. You might say, well, it's still not super solid yet. Give me a chance to keep going, and I'll build you a strong foundation and reveal to you that God did not do this accidentally. These narratives are put in place with very specific information, and if we're careful enough to dig and parse that information, we get some really solid takeaways, and that's what I'm hoping for. So I hope you'll be here next week. We're going to keep digging on this to see if we can't find any more pieces of information that may not be as helpful to you, for you, than it might be for you talking to somebody else in the future at some point that's just completely misguided. And they're going to think, by the way, they'll think of you the same way they think of me. Wow, that's kind of crazy, until you can sit them down and actually show them what I just showed you today. A careful, slow reading tells you this is not some accidental writing. This can't be of the pen of some stinky fisherman or some stinky tax collector that thought, well, okay, I'll write this down. There's too much in here that has evidence and factual pieces in it to say made up. So we need to keep digging, and maybe we'll walk away with something so solid here that when you share it with people, they too will say the same thing. There can't be any other thing than Jesus was not born December 25th, but we do know this, he was born. You don't write about somebody being born if they weren't born. We'll come back, but for right now, that's my message. You've been watching me, Pastor Melissa Scott, live from Glendale, California at Faith Center. If you would like to attend the service with us Sunday morning at 11 a.m., simply call 1-800-338-3030 to receive your pass. If you'd like more teaching and you'd like to go straight to our website, the address is www.pastormelissascott.com.